Don't forget to subscribe. Afterwards, the wisest and most spiritual books from the greatest authors await you every day. And now buckle up, sit back and we'll begin. Carlos Castaneda. Book 2. Task of Seeing. I began the exercise of listening to the sounds of the world and kept at it for 2 months, as Don Juan had specified. It was excruciating at first to listen and not look, but even more excruciating was not to talk to myself. By the end of the 2 months I was capable of shutting off my internal dialogue for short periods of time, and I was also capable of paying attention to sounds. I arrived at Don Juan's house at 9 a.m. on November 10, 1969. "We should start that trip right now," he said upon my arrival at his house. I rested for an hour, and then we drove toward the low slopes of the mountains to the east. We left my car in the care of one of his friends who lived in that area while we hiked into the mountains. Don Juan had put some crackers and sweet rolls in a knapsack for me. There were enough provisions for a day or two. I had asked Don Juan if we needed more. He shook his head negatively. We walked the entire morning. It was a rather warm day. I carried 1 canteen of water, most of which I drank myself. Don Juan drank only twice. When there was no more water, he assured me it was all right to drink from the streams we found on our way. He laughed at my reluctance. After a short while my thirst made me overcome my fears. In the early afternoon we stopped in a small valley at the bottom of some lush green hills. Behind the hills, toward the east, the high mountains were silhouetted against a cloudy sky. "You can think, you can write about what we say or about what you perceive, but nothing about where we are," he said. We rested for a while, and then he took a bundle from inside his shirt. He untied it and showed me his pipe. He filled its bowl with smoking mixture, lighted a match and kindled a small dry twig, placed the burning twig inside the bowl, and told me to smoke. Without a piece of charcoal inside the bowl it was difficult to light the pipe. We had to keep kindling twigs until the mixture caught on fire. When I had finished smoking, he said that we were there so I could find out the kind of game I was supposed to hunt. He carefully repeated 3 or 4 times that the most important aspect of my endeavor was to find some holes. He emphasized the word holes and said that inside them a sorcerer could find all sorts of messages and directions. I wanted to ask what kind of holes they were. Don Juan seemed to have guessed my question and said that they were impossible to describe and were in the realm of seeing. He repeated at various times that I should focus all my attention on listening to sounds and do my best to find the holes between the sounds. He said that he was going to play his spirit catcher 4 times. I was supposed to use those eerie calls as a guide to the ally that had welcomed me. That ally would then give me the message I was seeking. Don Juan told me I should stay in complete alertness, since he had no idea how the ally would manifest himself to me. I listened attentively. I was sitting with my back against a rock side of the hill. I experienced a mild numbness. Don Juan warned me against closing my eyes. I began to listen and I could distinguish the whistling of birds, the wind rustling the leaves, the buzzing of insects. As I placed my individual attention on those sounds, I could actually make out 4 different types of bird whistlings. I could distinguish the speeds of the wind, in terms of slow or fast. I could also hear the different rustlings of 3 types of leaves. The buzzlings of insects were dazzling. There were so many that I could not count them or correctly differentiate them. I was immersed in a strange world of sound, as I had never been in my life. I began to slide to my right. Don Juan made a motion to stop me, but I caught myself before he did. I straightened up and sat erect again. Don Juan moved my body until he had propped me on a crevice in the rock wall. He swept the small rocks from under my legs and placed the back of my head against a rock. He told me imperatively to look at the mountains to the southeast. I fixed my gaze in the distance, but he corrected me and said I should not gaze but look, sort of scanning, at the hills in front of me and at the vegetation on them. He repeated over and over that I should concentrate all my attention on my hearing. Sounds began to be prominent again. It was not so much that I wanted to hear them, rather, they had a way of forcing me to concentrate on them. The wind rustled the leaves. The wind came high above the trees, and then it dropped into the valley where we were. Upon dropping, it touched the leaves of the tall trees first. They made a peculiar sound which I fancied to be a sort of rich, raspy, lush sound. Then the wind hit the bushes, and their leaves sounded like a crowd of small things. It was an almost melodious sound, very engulfing and quite demanding. It seemed capable of drowning everything else. I found it displeasing. I felt embarrassed because it occurred to me that I was like the rustle of the bushes, nagging and demanding. The sound was so akin to me that I hated it. Then I heard the wind rolling on the ground. It was not a rustling sound but more of a whistle, almost a beep or a flat buzz. Listening to the sounds the wind was making, I realized that all three of them happened at once. I was wondering how I had been capable of isolating each of them, when I again became aware of the whistling of birds and the buzzing of insects. At one moment there were only the sounds of the wind, and the next moment a gigantic flow of other sounds emerged at once into my field of awareness. Logically, all the existing sounds must have been continually emitted during the time I was hearing only the wind. I could not count all the whistles of birds or buzzlings of insects, yet I was convinced I was listening to each separate sound as it was produced. Together they created a most extraordinary order. I cannot call it any other thing but order. It was an order of sounds that had a pattern, that is, every sound happened in sequence. Then I heard a unique prolonged wail. It made me shiver. Every other noise ceased for an instant, and the valley was dead still, as the reverberation of the wail reached the valley's outer limits. Then the noises began again. I picked up their pattern immediately. After a moment of attentive listening, I thought I understood Don Juan's recommendation to watch for the holes between the sounds. The pattern of noises had spaces in between sounds. For example, specific whistles of birds were timed and had pauses in between them, and so had all the other sounds I was perceiving. The rustling of leaves was like a binding glue that made them into a homogeneous buzz. The fact of the matter was that the timing of each sound was a unit in the overall pattern of sounds. Thus the spaces or pauses in between sounds were, if I paid attention to them, holes in a structure. I heard again the piercing wail of Don Juan's spirit catcher. It did not jolt me, but the sounds again ceased for an instant, and I perceived such a cessation as a hole, a very large hole. At that precise moment I shifted my attention from hearing to looking. I was looking at a cluster of low hills with lush green vegetation. The silhouette of the hills was arranged in such a way that from the place where I was looking there seemed to be a hole on the side of one of the hills. It was a space in between two hills, and through it, I could see the deep, dark, gray hue of the mountains in the distance. For a moment I did not know what it was. It was as if the hole I was looking at was the hole in the sound. Then the noises began again, but the visual image of the huge hole remained. A short while later I became even more keenly aware of the pattern of sounds and their order and the arrangement of their pauses. My mind was capable of distinguishing and discriminating among an enormous number of individual sounds. I could actually keep track of all the sounds, thus each pause between sounds was a definite whole. At a given moment the pauses became crystallized in my mind and formed a sort of solid grid, a structure. I was not seeing or hearing it. I was feeling it with some unknown part of myself. Don Juan played his string once again. The sounds ceased as they had done before, creating a huge hole in the sound structure. This time, however, that big pause blended with the hole in the hills I was looking at. They became superimposed on each other. The effect of perceiving two holes lasted for such a long time that I was capable of hearing their contours as they fit one another. Then the other sounds began again, and their structure of pauses became an extraordinary, almost visual perception. I began seeing the sounds as they created patterns, and then all those patterns became superimposed on the environment in the same way I had perceived the two big holes becoming superimposed. I was not looking or hearing as I was accustomed to doing. I was doing something which was entirely different, but combined features of both. For some reason my attention was focused on the large hole in the hills. I felt I was hearing it and at the same time looking at it. There was something of a lure about it. It dominated my field of perception, and every single sound pattern which coincided with a feature of the environment was hinged on that hole. I heard once more the eerie wail of Don Juan's spirit catcher. All other sounds stopped. The two large holes seemed to light up, and next, I was looking again at the plowed field. The ally was standing there as I had seen him before. The light of the total scene became very clear. I could see him plainly, as if he were 50 yards away. I could not see his face, his hat covered it. Then he began to come toward me, lifting up his head slowly as he walked. I could almost see his face, and that terrified me. I knew I had to stop him without delay. I had a strange surge in my body. I felt an outflow of power. I wanted to move my head to the side to stop the vision, but I could not do it. At that crucial instant a thought came to my mind. I knew what Don Juan meant when he spoke of the items of a path with heart being the shields. There was something I wanted to do in my life, something very consuming and intriguing, something that filled me with great peace and joy. I knew the ally could not overcome me. I moved my head away without any trouble before I could see his entire face. I began hearing all the other sounds. They suddenly became very loud and shrill, as if they were actually angry with me. They lost their patterns and turned into an amorphous conglomerate of sharp, painful shrieks. My ears began to buzz under their pressure. I felt that my head was about to explode. I stood up and put the palms of my hands to my ears. Don Juan helped me walk to a very small stream, made me take off my clothes, and rolled me in the water. He made me lie on the almost dry bed of the stream, and then gathered water in his hat and splashed me with it. The pressure in my ears subsided very rapidly, and it took only a few minutes to wash me." Don Juan looked at me, shook his head in approval, and said I had made myself solid in no time at all. I put on my clothes and he took me back to the place where I had been sitting. I felt extremely vigorous, buoyant, and clear-headed. He wanted to know all the details of my vision. He said that the holes in the sounds were used by sorcerers to find out specific things. A sorcerer's ally would reveal complicated affairs through the holes in the sounds. He refused to be more specific about the holes and sloughed off my questions, saying that since I did not have an ally, such information would only be harmful to me. "Everything is meaningful for a sorcerer," he said. "The sounds have holes in them, and so does everything around you. Ordinarily, a man does not have the speed to catch the holes, and thus he goes through life without protection. The worms, the birds, the trees, all of them can tell us unimaginable things, if only one could have the speed to grasp their message. The smoke can give us that grasping speed. But we must be on good terms with all the living things of this world. This is the reason why we must talk to plants we are about to kill and apologize for hurting them. The same thing must be done with the animals we are going to hunt. We should take only enough for our needs, otherwise the plants and the animals and the worms we have killed would turn against us and cause us disease and misfortune. A warrior is aware of this and strives to appease them, so when he peers through the holes, the trees and birds and the worms give him truthful messages. But all this is not important now. What is important is that you saw the ally. That is your game. I've told you that we were going to hunt for something. I thought it was going to be an animal. I figured that you were going to see the animal we had to hunt. I myself saw a wild boar. My spirit catcher is a wild boar." "Do you mean your spirit catcher is made out of a wild boar?" "No. Nothing in the life of a sorcerer is made out of anything else. If something is anything at all, it is the thing itself. If you knew wild boars, you would realize my spirit catcher is one. Why did we come here to hunt? The ally showed you a spirit catcher that he got from his pouch. You need to have one if you are going to call him. What is a spirit catcher? It is a fiber. With it I can call the allies, or my own ally, or I can call the spirits of water holes, the spirits of rivers, the spirits of mountains. Mine is a wild boar and cries like a wild boar. I used it twice around you to call the spirit of the water hole to help you. The spirit came to you as the ally came to you today. You could not see it, though, because you did not have the speed. However, that day I took you to the water canyon and put you on a rock. You knew the spirit was almost on top of you without actually seeing it. Those spirits are helpers. They are hard to handle and sort of dangerous. One needs an impeccable will to hold them at bay. What do they look like? They are different for every man, and so are the allies. For you, an ally would apparently look like a man you once knew, or like a man you will always be about to know. That's the bent of your nature. You are given to mysteries and secrets. I'm not like you, so an ally for me is something very precise. The spirits of water holes are proper to specific places. The one I called to help you is one I have known myself. It has helped me many times. Its abode is that canyon. At the time I called it to help you, you were not strong, and the spirit took you hard. That was not its intention, they have none, but you were lying there very weak, weaker than I suspected. Later on the spirit nearly lured you to your death, In the water at the irrigation canal you were phosphorescent. The spirit took you by surprise and you nearly succumbed. Once a spirit does that, it always comes back for its prey. I'm sure it will come back for you. Unfortunately, you need the water to become solid again when you use the little smoke. That puts you at a terrible disadvantage. If you don't use the water you will probably die, but if you do use it, the spirit will take you. Can I use water at another place? It doesn't make any difference. The spirit of the water hole around my house can follow you anywhere, unless you have a spirit catcher. That is why the ally showed it to you. He told you that you need one. He wrapped it around his left hand and came to you after pointing out the water canyon. Today he again wanted to show you the spirit catcher, as he did the first time you met him. It was wise of you to stop. The ally was going too fast for your strength, and a direct jolt with him would be very injurious to you. How can I get a spirit catcher now? Apparently the ally is going to give you one himself. How? I don't know. You will have to go to him. He has already told you where to look for it. Where? Up there, on those hills where you saw the hole. Would I be looking for the ally himself? No. But he is already welcoming you. The little smoke has opened your way to him. Then, later on, you will meet him face to face, but that will happen only after you know him very well. We arrived in the same valley in the late afternoon of December 15, 1969. Don Juan mentioned repeatedly as we moved through the shrubs that directions or points of orientation were of crucial importance in the endeavor I was going to undertake. You must determine the right direction immediately upon arriving at the top of a hill, Don Juan said. As soon as you are on the top, face that direction. He pointed to the southeast. That is your good direction and you should always face it, especially when you're in trouble. Remember that. We stopped at the bottom of the hills where I had perceived the hole. He pointed at a specific place where I had to sit down. He sat next to me and in a very quiet voice, gave me detailed instructions. He said that as soon as I reached the hilltop I had to extend my right arm in front of me with the palm of my hand down, and my fingers stretched like a fan, except the thumb, which had to be tucked against the palm. Next I had to turn my head to the north and fold my arm over my chest, pointing my hand also toward the north. Then I had to dance, putting my left foot behind the right one, beating the ground with the tip of my left toes. He said that when I felt a warmth coming up my left leg, I had to begin sweeping my arm slowly from north to south, and then to the north again. The spot over which the palm of your hand feels warm as you sweep your arm is the place where you must sit, and it is also the direction in which you must look, he said. If the spot is toward the east, or if it is in that direction, he pointed to the southeast, again the results will be excellent. If the spot where your hand gets warm is toward the north, you will take a bad beating, but you may turn the tide in your favor. If the spot is toward the south you will have a hard fight. You will need to sweep your arm up to 4 times at first, but as you become more familiar with the movement, you will need only one single sweep to know whether or not your hand is going to get warm. Once you establish a spot where your hand gets warm, sit there. That is your first point. If you are facing the south or the north, you have to make up your mind whether you feel strong enough to stay. If you have doubts about yourself, get up and leave. There is no need to stay if you are not confident. If you decide to stick around, clean an area big enough to build a fire about 5 feet away from your first point. The fire must be in a straight line in the direction you are looking. The area where you build the fire is your second point. Then gather all the twigs you can in between those 2 points and make a fire. Sit on your first point and look at the fire. Sooner or later the spirit will come and you will see it. If your hand does not get warm at all after 4 sweeping movements, sweep your arm slowly from north to south, and then turn around and sweep it to the west. If your hand gets warm on any place toward the west, drop everything and run. Run downhill toward the flat area, and no matter what you hear or feel behind you, don't turn around. As soon as you get to the flat area, no matter how frightened you are, don't keep on running. Drop to the ground, take off your jacket, bunch it around your navel, and curl up like a ball, tucking your knees against your stomach. You must also cover your eyes with your hands, and your arms have to remain tight against your thighs. You must stay in that position until morning. If you follow these simple steps, no harm will ever come to you. In case you cannot get to the flat area in time, drop to the ground right where you are. You will have a horrid time there. You will be harassed, but if you keep calm and don't move or look, you will come out of it without a single scratch. Now if your hand does not get warm at all while you sweep it to the west, face the east again, and run in an easterly direction until you are out of breath. Stop there and repeat the same maneuvers. You must keep on running toward the east, repeating these movements, until your hand gets warm. After giving me these instructions, he made me repeat them until I had memorized them. Then we sat in silence for a long time. I attempted to revive the conversation a couple of times, but he forced me into silence each time by an imperative gesture. It was getting dark when Don Juan got up and without a word began climbing the hill. I followed him. At the top of the hill I performed all the movements he had prescribed. Don Juan stood by, a short distance away, and kept a sharp look on me. I was very careful and deliberately slow. I tried to feel any perceivable change of temperature, but I could not detect whether or not the palm of my hand became warm. By that time it was fairly dark, yet I was still capable of running in an easterly direction without stumbling on the shrubs. I stopped running when I was out of breath, which was not too far from my point of departure. I was extremely tired and tense. My forearms ached and so did my calves. I repeated there all the required motions, and again had the same negative results. I ran in the dark 2 more times, and then, while I was sweeping my arm for the 3rd time, my hand became warm over a point toward the east. It was such a definite change of temperature that it startled me. I sat down and waited for Don Juan. I told him I had detected a change in temperature in my hand. He told me to proceed, and I picked all the dry brush I could find and started a fire. He sat to my left a couple of feet away. The fire drew strange, dancing silhouettes. At times the flames became iridescent, they grew bluish and then brilliantly white. I explained that unusual play of colors by assuming that it was produced by some chemical property of the specific dry twigs and branches I had collected. Another very unusual feature of the fire was the sparks. The new twigs I kept adding created extremely big sparks. I thought they were like tennis balls that seemed to explode in midair. I stared at the fire fixedly, the way I believed Don Juan had recommended, and I became dizzy. He handed me his water gourd and signaled me to drink. The water relaxed me and gave me a delightful feeling of freshness. Don Juan leaned over and whispered in my ear that I did not have to stare at the flames, that I should only watch in the direction of the fire. I became very cold and clammy after watching for almost an hour. At a moment when I was about to lean over and pick up a twig, something like a moth or a spot in my retina swept across from right to left between myself and the fire. I immediately recoiled. I looked at Don Juan, and he signaled me with a movement of his chin to look back at the flames. A moment later the same shadow swept across in the opposite direction. Don Juan got up hurriedly and began piling loose dirt on top of the burning twigs until he had completely extinguished the flames. He executed the maneuver of putting out the fire with tremendous speed. By the time I moved to help him, he had finished. He stomped on the dirt on top of the smoldering twigs, and then he nearly dragged me downhill and out of the valley. He walked very fast without turning his head back and did not allow me to talk at all. When we got to my car hours later, I asked him what was the thing I had seen. He shook his head imperatively and we drove in complete silence. He went directly inside when we arrived at his house in the early morning, and he again hushed me up when I tried to talk. Don Juan was sitting outside, behind his house. He seemed to have been waiting for me to wake up, because he started talking as I came out of the house. He said that the shadow I had seen the night before was a spirit, a force that belonged to the particular place where I had seen it. He spoke of that specific being as a useless one. It only exists there, he said. It has no secrets of power, so there was no point in remaining there. You would have seen only a fast passing shadow going back and forth all night. There are other types of beings, however, that can give you secrets of power, if you are fortunate enough to find them. We ate some breakfast then and did not talk for quite a while. After eating, we sat in front of his house. There are three kinds of beings, he said suddenly: those that cannot give anything because they have nothing to give, those that can only cause fright, and those that have gifts. The one you saw last night was a silent one. It has nothing to give, it is only a shadow. Most of the time, however, another type of being is associated with the silent one, a nasty spirit whose only quality is to cause fear, and which always hovers around the abode of a silent one. That is why I decided to get out of there fast. That nasty type follows people right into their homes and makes life impossible for them. I know people who have had to move out of their houses because of them. There are always some people who believe they can get a lot out of that kind of being, but the mere fact that a spirit is around the house does not mean anything. People may try to entice it, or they may follow it around the house under the impression that it can reveal secrets to them. But the only thing people would get is a frightful experience. I know people who took turns watching one of those nasty beings that had followed them into their house. They watched the spirit for months. Finally, someone else had to step in and drag the people out of the house. They had become weak and were wasting away. So the only wise thing one can do with that nasty type is to forget about it and leave it alone. I asked him how people enticed a spirit. He said that people took pains to figure out first where the spirit would most likely appear, and then they put weapons in its way, in hopes that it might touch the weapons, because spirits were known to like paraphernalia of war. Don Juan said that any kind of gear, or any object, that was touched by a spirit, rightfully became a power object. However, The nasty type of being was known never to touch anything, but only to produce the auditory illusion of noise. I then asked Don Juan about the manner in which those spirits caused fear. He said that their most common way of frightening people was to appear as a dark shadow, shaped as a man that would roam around the house, creating a frightening clatter or creating the sound of voices, or as a dark shadow that would suddenly lurch out from a dark corner. Don Juan said that the third type of spirit was a true ally, a giver of secrets. That special type existed in lonely, abandoned places which were almost inaccessible. He said that a man who wished to find one of these beings had to travel far and go by himself. At a distant and lonely place, the man had to take all the necessary steps alone. He had to sit by his fire, and if he saw the shadow, he had to leave immediately. He had to remain, however, if he encountered other conditions, such as a strong wind that would kill his fire and would keep him from kindling it again during 4 attempts, or if a branch broke from a nearby tree. The branch really had to break, and the man had to make sure that it was not merely the sound of a branch breaking off. Other conditions he had to be aware of were rocks that rolled, or pebbles which were thrown at his fire, or any constant noise, and he then had to walk in the direction in which any of these phenomena occurred until the spirit revealed itself. There were many ways in which such a being put a warrior to the test. It might suddenly leap in front of him, in the most horrendous appearance, or it might grab the man from the back and not turn him loose and keep him pinned down for hours. It might also topple a tree on him. Don Juan said that those were truly dangerous forces, and although they could not kill a man hand to hand, they could cause his death by fright, or by actually letting objects fall on him, or by appearing suddenly and causing him to stumble, lose his footing, and go over a precipice. He told me that if I ever found one of those beings under inappropriate circumstances, I should never attempt to struggle with it, because it would kill me. It would rob my soul. So I should throw myself to the ground and bear it until the morning. When a man is facing the ally, the giver of secrets, he has to muster up all his courage and grab it before it grabs him, or chase it before it chases him. The chase must be relentless, and then comes the struggle. The man must wrestle the spirit to the ground and keep it there until it gives him power. I asked him if these forces had substance, if one could really touch them. I said that the very idea of a spirit connoted something ethereal to me. "Don't call them spirits," he said. "Call them allies, call them inexplicable forces." He was silent for a while, then he lay on his back and propped his head on his folded arms. I insisted on knowing if those beings had substance. "You're damn right they have substance," he said after another moment of silence. "When one struggles with them, they are solid, but that feeling lasts only a moment. Those beings rely on a man's fear, therefore if the man struggling with one of them is a warrior, the being loses its tension very quickly, while the man becomes more vigorous. One can actually absorb the spirit's tension." "What kind of tension is that?" I asked. "Power. When one touches them, they vibrate as if they were ready to rip one apart. But that is only a show. The tension ends when the man maintains his grip." "What happens when they lose their tension? Do they become like air?" "No, they just become flaccid. They still have substance, though. But it is not like anything one has ever touched." Later on, during the evening, I said to him that perhaps what I had seen the night before could have been only a moth. He laughed and very patiently explained that moths fly back and forth only around light bulbs because a light bulb cannot burn their wings. A fire, on the other hand, would burn them the first time they came close to it. He also pointed out that the shadow covered the entire fire. When he mentioned that, I remembered that it was really an extremely large shadow, and that it actually blocked the view of the fire for an instant. However, it had happened so fast that I had not emphasized it in my earlier recollection. Then he pointed out that the sparks were very large and flew to my left. I had noticed that myself. I said that the wind was probably blowing in that direction. Don Juan replied that there was no wind whatsoever. That was true. Upon recalling my experience, I could remember that the night was still. Another thing I had completely overlooked was a greenish glow in the flames, which I detected when Don Juan signaled me to keep on looking at the fire after the shadow had first crossed my field of vision. Don Juan reminded me of it. He also objected to my calling it a shadow. He said it was round and more like a bubble. 2 days later, on December 17, 1969, Don Juan said in a very casual tone that I knew all the details and necessary techniques in order to go to the hills by myself and obtain a power object, the spirit catcher. He urged me to proceed alone and affirmed that his company would only hinder me. I was ready to leave when he seemed to change his mind. "You're not strong enough," he said. "I'll go with you to the bottom of the hills." When we were at the small valley where I had seen the ally, he examined from a distance the formation in the terrain that I had called a hole in the hills and said that we had to go still further south into the distant mountains. The abode of the ally was at the furthermost point we could see through the hole. I looked at the formation and all I could distinguish was the bluish mass of the distant mountains. He guided me, however, in a southeasterly direction, and after hours of walking we reached a point he said was deep enough into the allies' abode. It was late afternoon when we stopped. We sat down on some rocks. I was tired and hungry. All I had eaten during the day was some tortillas and water. Don Juan stood up all of a sudden, looked at the sky, and told me in a commanding tone to take off in the direction that was the best for me, and to be sure I could remember the spot where we were at the moment, so I could return there whenever I was through. He said in a reassuring tone that he would be waiting for me if it took me forever. I asked apprehensively if he believed that the affair of getting a spirit catcher was going to take a long time. "Who knows?" he said, smiling mysteriously. I walked away toward the southeast, turning around a couple of times to look at Don Juan. He was walking very slowly in the opposite direction. I climbed to the top of a large hill and looked at Don Juan once again. He was a good 200 yards away. He did not turn to look at me. I ran downhill into a small bowl-like depression between the hills, and I suddenly found myself alone. I sat down for a moment and began to wonder what I was doing there. I felt ludicrous looking for a spirit catcher. I ran back up to the top of the hill to have a better view of Don Juan, but I could not see him anywhere. I ran downhill in the direction I had last seen him. I wanted to call off the whole affair and go home. I felt quite stupid and tired. "Don Juan!" I yelled over and over. He was nowhere in sight. I again ran to the top of another steep hill. I could not see him from there either. I ran quite a way looking for him, but he had disappeared. I retraced my steps and went back to the original place where he had left me. I had the absurd certainty I was going to find him sitting there laughing at my inconsistencies. "What in the hell have I gotten into?" I said loudly. I knew then that there was no way to stop whatever I was doing there. I really did not know how to go back to my car. Don Juan had changed directions various times, and the general orientation of the 4 cardinal points was not enough. I was afraid of getting lost in the mountains. I sat down, and for the first time in my life I had the strange feeling that there never really was a way to revert back to an original point of departure. Don Juan had said that I always insisted on starting at a point I called the beginning, when in effect the beginning did not exist. And there in the middle of those mountains I felt I understood what he meant. It was as if the point of departure had always been myself. It was as if Don Juan had never really been there, and when I looked for him he became what he really was, a fleeting image that vanished over a hill. I heard the soft rustle of leaves and a strange fragrance enveloped me. I felt the wind as a pressure on my ears, like a shy buzzing. The sun was about to reach some compact clouds over the horizon that looked like a solidly tinted orange band. When it disappeared behind a heavy blanket of lower clouds, it appeared again a moment later, like a crimson ball floating in the mist. It seemed to struggle for a while to get into a patch of blue sky, but it was as if the clouds would not give the sun time, and then the orange band and the dark silhouette of the mountains seemed to swallow it up. I lay down on my back. The world around me was so still, so serene, and at the same time so alien. I felt overwhelmed. I did not want to weep, but tears rolled down easily. I remained in that position for hours. I was almost unable to get up. The rocks under me were hard, and right where I had lain down there was scarcely any vegetation, in contrast to the lush green bushes all around. From where I was I could see a fringe of tall trees on the eastern hills. Finally it got fairly dark. I felt better. In fact, I felt almost happy. For me, the semi-darkness was much more nurturing and protective than the hard daylight. I stood up, climbed to the top of a small hill, and began repeating the motions Don Juan had taught me. I ran toward the east 7 times, and then I noticed a change of temperature on my hand. I built a fire and set a careful watch, as Don Juan had recommended, observing every detail. Hours went by and I began to feel very tired and cold. I had gathered quite a pile of dry twigs. I fed the fire and moved closer to it. The vigil was so strenuous and so intense that it exhausted me. I began to nod. I fell asleep twice and woke up only when my head bobbed to one side. I was so sleepy that I could not watch the fire anymore. I drank some water and even sprinkled some on my face to keep awake. I succeeded in fighting my sleepiness only for brief moments. I had somehow become despondent and irritable. I felt utterly stupid being there, and that gave me a sensation of irrational frustration and dejection. I was tired, hungry, sleepy, and absurdly annoyed with myself. I finally gave up the struggle of keeping awake. I added a lot of dry twigs to the fire and lay down to sleep. The pursuit of an ally and a spirit catcher was at that moment a most ludicrous and foreign endeavor. I was so sleepy that I could not even think or talk to myself. I fell asleep. I was awakened suddenly by a loud crack. It appeared that the noise, whatever it was, had come from just above my left ear, since I was lying on my right side. I sat up fully awake. My left ear buzzed and was deafened by the proximity and force of the sound. I must have been asleep for only a short while, judging by the amount of dry twigs which were still burning in the fire. I did not hear any other noises, but I remained alert and kept on feeding the fire. The thought crossed my mind that perhaps what woke me up was a gunshot, perhaps someone was around watching me, taking shots at me. The thought became very anguishing and created an avalanche of rational fears. I was sure that someone owned that land, and if that was so, they might take me for a thief and kill me, or they might kill me to rob me, not knowing that I had nothing with me. I experienced a moment of terrible concern for my safety. I felt the tension in my shoulders and my neck. I moved my head up and down. The bones of my neck made a cracking sound. I still kept looking into the fire, but I did not see anything unusual in it, nor did I hear any noises. After a while I relaxed quite a bit, and it occurred to me that perhaps Don Juan was at the bottom of all this. I rapidly became convinced that it was so. The thought made me laugh. I had another avalanche of rational conclusions, nappy conclusions this time. I thought that Don Juan must have suspected I was going to change my mind about staying in the mountains, or he must have seen me running after him and taken cover in a concealed cave or behind a bush. Then he had followed me and, noticing I had fallen asleep, waked me up by cracking a branch near my ear. I added more twigs to the fire and began to look around in a casual and covert manner to see if I could spot him, even though I knew that if he was hiding around there, I would not be able to discover him. Everything was quite placid. The crickets, the wind roughing the trees on the slopes of the hills surrounding me, the soft cracking sound of the twigs catching on fire. Sparks flew around, but they were only ordinary sparks. Suddenly I heard the loud noise of a branch snapping in two. The sound came from my left. I held my breath as I listened with utmost concentration. An instant later I heard another branch snapping on my right. Then I heard the faint faraway sound of snapping branches. It was as if someone was stepping on them and making them crack. The sounds were rich and full, they had a lusty quality. They also seemed to be getting closer to where I was. I had a very slow reaction and did not know whether to listen or stand up. I was deliberating what to do when all of a sudden the sound of snapping branches happened all around me. I was engulfed by them so fast that I barely had time to jump to my feet and stomp on the fire. I began to run downhill in the darkness. The thought crossed my mind as I moved through the shrubs that there was no flat land. I kept on trotting and trying to protect my eyes from the bushes. I was halfway down to the bottom of the hill when I felt something behind me, almost touching me. It was not a branch, it was something which I intuitively felt was overtaking me. This realization made me freeze. I took off my jacket, bundled it on my stomach, crouched over my legs, and covered my eyes with my hands, as Don Juan had prescribed. I kept that position for a short while, and then I realized that everything around me was dead still. There were no sounds of any kind. I became extraordinarily alarmed. The muscles of my stomach contracted and shivered spasmodically. Then I heard another cracking sound. It seemed to have occurred far away, but it was extremely clear and distinct. It happened once more, closer to me. There was an interval of quietness, and then something exploded just above my head. The suddenness of the noise made me jump involuntarily, and I nearly rolled over on my side. It was definitely the sound of a branch being snapped in two. The sound had happened so close that I heard the rustling of the branch leaves as it was being cracked. Next there was a downpour of cracking explosions. Branches were being snapped with great force all around me. The incongruous thing, at that point, was my reaction to the whole phenomenon. Instead of being terrified, I was laughing. I sincerely thought I had hit upon the cause of all that was happening. I was convinced that Don Juan was again tricking me. A series of logical conclusions cemented my confidence. I felt elated. I was sure I could catch that foxy old Don Juan in another of his tricks. He was around me cracking branches, and knowing I would not dare to look up, he was safe and free to do anything he wanted to. I figured that he had to be alone in the mountains, since I had been with him constantly for days. He had not had fine time or the opportunity to engage any collaborators. If he was hiding, as I thought, he was hiding by himself, and logically, he could produce only a limited number of noises. Since he was alone, the noises had to occur in a linear temporal sequence, that is, one at a time, or at most two or three at a time. Besides, the variety of noises also had to be limited to the mechanics of a single individual. I was absolutely certain, as I remained crouched and still, that the whole experience was a game, and that the only way to remain on top of it was by emotionally dislodging myself from it. I was positively enjoying it. I caught myself chuckling at the idea that I could anticipate my opponent's next move. I tried to imagine what I would do next if I were Don Juan. The sound of something slurping jolted me out of my mental exercise. I listened attentively. The sound happened again. I could not determine what it was. It sounded like an animal slurping water. It happened again very close by. It was an irritating sound that brought to mind the smacking noise of a big-jawed adolescent girl chewing gum. I was wondering how Don Juan could produce such a noise when the sound happened again, coming from the right. There was a single sound first, and then I heard a series of slushing, slurping sounds, as if someone were walking in mud. It was an almost sensual, exasperating sound of feet slushing in deep mud. The noises stopped for a moment and started once more toward my left, very close, perhaps only 10 feet away. Now they sounded as if a heavy person were trotting with rain boots in mud. I marveled at the richness of the sound. I could not imagine any primitive devices that I myself could use to produce it. I heard another series of trotting, slushing sounds toward my rear, and then they happened all at once, on all sides. Someone seemed to be walking, running, trotting on mud all around me. A logical doubt occurred to me. If Don Juan was doing all that, he had to be running in circles at an incredible speed. The rapidity of the sounds made that alternative impossible. I then thought that Don Juan must have confederates after all. I wanted to involve myself in speculation as to who his accomplices could be, but the intensity of the noises took all my concentration. I really could not think clearly, yet I was not afraid. I was perhaps only dumbfounded by the strange quality of the sounds. The slashings actually vibrated. In fact, their peculiar vibrations seemed to be directed at my stomach, or perhaps I perceived their vibrations with the lower part of my abdomen. That realization brought an instantaneous loss of my sense of objectivity and aloofness. The sounds were attacking my stomach. The question occurred to me, what if it was not Don Juan? I panicked. I tensed my abdominal muscles and tucked my thighs hard against the bundle of my jacket. The noises increased in number and speed, as if they knew I had lost my confidence. Their vibrations were so intense I wanted to vomit. I fought the feeling of nausea. I took deep breaths and began to sing my payet songs. I got sick and the slushing noises ceased at once. The sounds of crickets and wind and the distant staccato barking of coyotes became superimposed. The abrupt cessation allowed me a respite, and I took stock of myself. Only a short while before I had been in the best of spirits, confident and aloof. Obviously I had failed miserably to judge the situation. Even if Don Juan had accomplices, it would be mechanically impossible for them to produce sounds that would affect my stomach. To produce sounds of such intensity, they would have needed gadgetry beyond their means or their conception. Apparently the phenomenon I was experiencing was not a game, and the another one of Don Juan's tricks theory was only my rude explanation. I had cramps and an overwhelming desire to roll over and straighten my legs. I decided to move to my right in order to get my face off the place where I had gotten sick. The instant I began to crawl, I heard a very soft squeak right above my left ear. I froze on the spot. The squeak was repeated on the other side of my head. It was a single sound. I thought it resembled the squeak of a door. I waited but I heard nothing else, so I decided to move again. No sooner had I started to inch my head to the right when I was nearly forced to jump up. A flood of squeaks engulfed me at once. They were like squeaks of doors at times, at other times they were like the squeaks of rats or guinea pigs. They were not loud or intense but very soft and insidious, and produced agonizing spasms of nausea in me. They stopped as they had begun, diminishing gradually until I could hear only one or two of them at a time. Then I heard something like the wings of a big bird sweeping over the tops of the bushes. It seemed to be flying in circles over my head. The soft squeaks began to increase again, and so did the flapping wings. Above my head there seemed to be something like a flock of gigantic birds beating their soft wings. Both noises merged, creating an enveloping wave around me. I felt that I was floating suspended in an enormous undulating ripple. The squeaks and the flapping were so smooth I could feel them all over my body. The flapping wings of a flock of birds seemed to be pulling me up from above, while the squeaks of an army of rats seemed to be pushing me from underneath and from around my body. There was no doubt in my mind that through my blundering stupidity, I had unleashed something terrible on myself. I clenched my teeth and took deep breaths and sang payet songs. The noises lasted a very long time, and I opposed them with all my might. When they subsided, there was again an interrupted silence, as I am accustomed to perceiving silence. That is, I could detect only the natural sounds of the insects and the wind. The time of silence was for me more deleterious than the time of noises. I began to think and to assess my position, and my deliberation threw me into a panic. I knew that I was lost. I did not have the knowledge nor the stamina to fend off whatever was accosting me. I was utterly helpless, crouched over my own vomit. I thought that the end of my life had come and I began to weep. I wanted to think about my life, but I did not know where to start. Nothing of what I had done in my life was really worthy of that last ultimate emphasis, so I had nothing to think about. That was an exquisite realization. I had changed since the last time I experienced a similar fright. This time I was more empty. I had less personal feelings to carry along. I asked myself what a warrior would do in that situation, and I arrived at various conclusions. There was something about my umbilical region that was uniquely important. There was something unearthly about the sounds. They were aiming at my stomach, and the idea that Don Juan was tricking me was utterly untenable. The muscles of my stomach were very tight, although I did not have cramps any longer. I kept on singing and breathing deeply, and I felt a soothing warmth inundating my entire body. It had become clear to me that if I was going to survive, I had to proceed in terms of Don Juan's teachings. I repeated his instructions in my mind. I remembered the exact point where the sun had disappeared over the mountains in relation to the hill where I was, and to the place where I had crouched. I reoriented myself, and when I was convinced that my assessment of the cardinal points was correct, I began to change my position, so I would have my head pointing in a new and better direction, the southeast. I slowly started moving my feet toward my left, inch by inch, until I had them twisted under my calves. Then I began to align my body with my feet, but no sooner had I begun to creep laterally than I felt a peculiar tap. I had the actual physical sensation of something touching the uncovered area of the back of my neck. It happened so fast that I yelled involuntarily and froze again. I tightened my abdominal muscles and began to breathe deeply and sing my payet songs. A second later I felt once more the same light tap on my neck. I cringed. My neck was uncovered and there was nothing I could do to protect myself. I was tapped again. It was a very soft, almost silky object that touched my neck, like the furry paw of a giant rabbit. It touched me again, and then it began to cross my neck back and forth until I was in tears. It was as if a herd of silent, smooth, weightless kangaroos were stepping on my neck. I could hear the soft thump of the paws as they stepped gently over me. It was not a painful sensation at all, and yet it was maddening. I knew that if I did not involve myself in doing something I would go mad and stand up and run. So I slowly began again to maneuver my body into a new position. My attempt at moving seemed to increase the tapping on my neck. It finally got to such a frenzy that I jerked my body and at once aligned it in the new direction. I had no idea whatsoever about the outcome of my act. I was just taking action to keep from going stark raving mad. As soon as I changed directions, the tapping on my neck ceased. After a long, anguished pause, I heard a distant snapping of branches. The noises were not close anymore. It was as if they had retreated to another position far away from me. The sound of snapping branches merged after a moment with a blasting sound of leaves being rustled, as if a strong wind were beating the entire hill. All the bushes around me seemed to shiver, yet there was no wind. The rustling sound and the cracking of branches gave me the feeling that the whole hill was on fire. My body was as tight as a rock. I was perspiring copiously. I began to feel warmer and warmer. For a moment I was utterly convinced that the hill was burning. I did not jump up and run because I was so numb I was paralyzed. In fact, I could not even open my eyes. All that mattered to me at that point was to get up and escape the fire. I had terrible cramps in my stomach which started to cut my intake of air. I became very involved in trying to breathe. After a long struggle, I was capable of taking deep breaths again, and I was also capable of noticing that the rustling had subsided. There was only an occasional cracking sound. The snapping sound of branches became more and more distant and sporadic until it ceased altogether. I was able to open my eyes. I looked through my half-closed lids to the ground underneath me. It was already daylight. I waited a while longer without moving, and then I started to stretch my body. I rolled on my back. The sun was over the hills in the east. It took me hours to straighten out my legs and drag myself downhill. I began to walk toward the place where Don Juan had left me, which was perhaps only a mile away. By mid-afternoon I was barely at the edge of some woods, still a good quarter of a mile away. I could not walk anymore, not for any reason. I thought of mountain lions and tried to climb up a tree, but my arms could not support my weight. I leaned against a rock and resigned myself to die there. I was convinced that I would be food for mountain lions or other predators. I did not have the strength even to throw a rock. I was not hungry or thirsty. Around noon I had found a small stream and had drunk a lot of water, but the water did not help to restore my strength. As I sat there in utter helplessness, I felt more despondent than afraid. I was so tired I did not care about my fate and I fell asleep. I woke up when something shook me. Don Juan was leaning over me. He helped me sit up and gave me water and some gruel. He laughed and said that I looked wretched. I tried to tell him what had happened, but he hushed me up and said that I had missed my mark, that the place where I was supposed to meet him was about 100 yards away. Then he half carried me downhill. He said he was taking me to a large stream and was going to wash me there. On the way he plugged my ears with some leaves he had in his pouch, and then he blindfolded me, putting one leaf on each eye and securing them both with a piece of cloth. He made me take off my clothes and told me to place my hands over my eyes and ears to make sure I could not see or hear anything. Don Juan rubbed my entire body with leaves and then dumped me in a river. I felt it was a large river. It was deep. I was standing and I could not touch the bottom. Don Juan was holding me by the right elbow. At first I did not feel the coldness of the water, but little by little I began to feel chilled, and then the cold became intolerable. Don Juan pulled me out and dried me with some leaves that had a peculiar scent. I put on my clothes and he led me away. We walked a good distance before he took the leaves off my ears and my eyes. Don Juan asked me if I felt strong enough to walk back to my car. The weird thing was that I felt very strong. I even ran up the side of a steep hill to prove it. On the way to my car I stayed very close to Don Juan. I stumbled scores of times and he laughed. I noticed that his laughter was especially invigorating, and it became the focal point of my replenishing. The more he laughed, the better I felt. The next day I narrated to Don Juan the sequence of events from the time he left me. He laughed all the way through my account, especially when I told him that I had thought it was one of his tricks. "You always think you're being tricked," he said. "You trust yourself too much. You act like you know all the answers. You know nothing, my little friend, nothing." This was the first time Don Juan had called me my little friend. It took me aback. He noticed it and smiled. There was a great warmth in his voice, and that made me very sad. I told him that I had been careless and incompetent because that was the inherent bent of my personality, and that I would never understand his world. I felt deeply moved. He was very encouraging and asserted that I had done fine. I asked him the meaning of my experience. "It has no meaning," he replied. The same thing could happen to anyone, especially someone like you who has his gap already opened. It is very common. Any warrior who's gone in search of allies would tell you about their doings. What they did to you was mild. However, your gap is open, and that is why you're so nervous. One cannot turn into a warrior overnight. Now you must go home and don't return until you're healed and your gap is closed. I did not return to Mexico for months. I used the time to work on my field notes, and for the first time in 10 years, since I started the apprenticeship, Don Juan's teachings began to make real sense. I felt that the long periods of time I had to stay away from the apprenticeship had had a very sobering and beneficial effect on me. They had allowed me the opportunity to review my findings and to arrange them in an intellectual order proper of my training and interest. The events that took place on my last visit to the field, however, pointed to a fallacy in my optimism about understanding Don Juan's knowledge. I made the last entry in my field notes on October 16, 1970. The events that took place on that occasion marked a transition. They not only closed a cycle of instruction, but they also opened a new one, which was so very different from what I had done thus far, that I feel this is the point where I must end my reportage. As I approached Don Juan's house, I saw him sitting in his usual place under his ramada in front of the door. I parked in the shade of a tree, took my briefcase and a bag of groceries out of the car and walked toward him, greeting him in a loud voice. I then noticed that he was not alone. There was another man sitting behind a high pile of firewood. Both of them were looking at me. Don Juan waved, and so did the other man. Judging from his attire, he was not an Indian but a Mexican from the Southwest. He was wearing Levi's, a beige shirt, a Texan cowboy hat and cowboy boots. I talked to Don Juan and then looked at the man. He was smiling at me. I stared at him for a moment. "Here's little Carlos," the man said to Don Juan, "and he doesn't speak to me anymore. Don't tell me that he's cross with me." Before I could say anything, they both broke up laughing, and only then did I realize that the strange man was Don Gennaro. "You didn't recognize me, did you?" he asked, still laughing. I had to admit that his attire had baffled me. "What are you doing in this part of the world, Don Gennaro?" I asked. "He came to enjoy the hot wind," Don Juan said. "Isn't that right?" "That's right," Don Gennaro echoed. "You've no idea what the hot wind can do to an old body like mine." I sat down between them. "What does it do to your body?" I asked. "The hot wind tells extraordinarily things to my body," he said. He turned to Don Juan, his eyes glittering. "Isn't that so?" Don Juan shook his head affirmatively. I told them that the time of the hot Santa Ana winds was the worst part of the year for me, and that it was certainly strange that Don Gennaro would come to seek the hot wind while I was running away from it. "Carlos can't stand the heat," Don Juan said to Don Gennaro. "When it gets hot he becomes like a child and suffocates." "What?" "Suffocates." "My goodness," Don Gennaro said, feigning concern, and made a gesture of despair which was indescribably funny. Don Juan explained to him next that I had been away for months because of an unfortunate incident with the Allies. "So, you've finally encountered an ally?" Don Gennaro said. "I think I did," I said cautiously. They laughed loudly. Don Gennaro patted me on the back 2 or 3 times. It was a very light tapping which I interpreted as a friendly gesture of concern. He rested his hand on my shoulder as he looked at me, and I had a feeling of placid contentment, which lasted only an instant, for next Don Gennaro did something inexplicable to me. I suddenly felt that he had put the weight of a boulder on my back. I had the sensation that he had increased the weight of his hand, which was resting on my right shoulder, until it made me sag all the way down, and I hit my head on the ground. "We must help little Carlos," Don Gennaro said, and gave a conspiratorial look to Don Juan. I sat up straight again and turned to Don Juan, but he looked away. I had a moment of vacillation, and the annoying thought that Don Juan was acting as if he were aloof, detached from me. Don Gennaro was laughing. He seemed to be waiting for my reaction. I asked him to put his hand on my shoulder once more, but he did not want to do it. I urged him at least to tell me what he had done to me. He chuckled. I turned to Don Juan again and told him that the weight of Don Gennaro's hand had nearly crushed me. "I don't know anything about it," Don Juan said in a comically factual tone. "He didn't put his hand on my shoulder." With that, both of them broke up laughing. "What did you do to me, Don Gennaro?" I asked. "I just put my hand on your shoulder," he said innocently. "Do it again," I said. He refused. Don Juan interceded at that point and asked me to describe to Don Gennaro what I had perceived in my last experience. I thought he wanted me to give a bona fide description of what had happened to me, but the more serious my description became, the more they laughed. I stopped 2 or 3 times, but they urged me to go on. "The ally will come to you regardless of your feelings," Don Juan said when I had finished my account. "I mean, you don't have to do anything to lure him out. You may be sitting twiddling your thumbs or thinking about women, and then suddenly, a tap on your shoulder, you turn around and the ally is standing by you. What can I do if something like that happens?" I asked. Hey, wait a minute," Don Gennaro said. "That's not a good question. You shouldn't ask what can you do, obviously you can't do anything. You should ask what can a warrior do?" He turned to me, blinking. His head was slightly tilted to the right, and his mouth was puckered. I looked at Don Juan for a cue whether the situation was a joke, but he kept a solemn face. "All right," I said. "What can a warrior do?" Don Gennaro blinked and made smacking sounds with his lips, as if he were searching for a right word. He looked at me fixedly, holding his chin. "A warrior wets his pants," he said with Indian solemnity. Don Juan covered his face and Don Gennaro slapped the ground, exploding in a howling laughter. "Fright is something one can never get over," Don Juan said after the laughter had subsided. "When a warrior is caught in such a tight spot, he would simply turn his back to the ally without thinking twice. A warrior cannot indulge, thus he cannot die of fright. A warrior allows the ally to come only when he is good and ready. When he is strong enough to grapple with the ally, he opens his gap and lurches out, grabs the ally, keeps him pinned down, and maintains his stare on him for exactly the time he has to. Then he moves his eyes away and releases the ally and lets him go. A warrior, my little friend, is the master at all times. What happens if you stare at an ally for too long?" I asked. Don Gennaro looked at me and made a comical gesture of outstaring. "Who knows?" Don Juan said. "Maybe Gennaro will tell you what happened to him." "Maybe," Don Gennaro said and chuckled. Would you please tell me? Don Gennaro got up, cracked his bones stretching his arms, and opened his eyes until they were round and looked crazy. Gennaro is going to make the desert tremble, he said and went into the chaparral. Gennaro is determined to help you, Don Juan said in a confidential tone. He did the same thing to you at his house, and you almost saw. I thought he was referring to what had happened at the waterfall, but he was talking about some unearthly rumbling sounds I had heard at Don Gennaro's house. By the way, what was it? I asked. We laughed at it, but you never explained to me what it was. You have never asked? I did. No. You have asked me about everything else except that. Don Juan looked at me accusingly. That was Gennaro's art, he said. Only Gennaro can do that. You almost saw then. I told him that it had never occurred to me to associate seeing with the strange noises I had heard at that time. And why not? He asked flatly. Seeing means the eyes to me, I said. He scrutinized me for a moment as if there were something wrong with me. I never said that seeing is a matter of the eyes alone, he said and shook his head in disbelief. How does he do it? I insisted. He has already told you how he does it, Don Juan said sharply. At that very moment I heard an extraordinary rumble. I jumped up and Don Juan began to laugh. The rumble was like a thunderous avalanche. Listening to it, I had the funny realization that my inventory of experiences in sound conies definitely from the movies. The deep thunder I heard resembled the soundtrack of a movie when the whole side of a mountain falls into a valley. Don Juan held his sides as if they hurt from laughing. The thunderous rumble shook the ground where I stood. I distinctly heard the thump of what seemed to be a monumental boulder that was rolling on its sides. I heard a series of crushing thumps that gave me the impression that the boulder was rolling inexorably toward me. I experienced a moment of supreme confusion. My muscles were tense, my whole body was ready for fleeing. I looked at Don Juan. He was staring at me. I then heard the most frightening thump I had ever heard in my life. It was as if a monumental boulder had landed right behind the house. Everything shook, and at that moment I had a most peculiar perception. For an instant I actually saw a boulder the size of a mountain right behind the house. It was not as if an image had been superimposed on the scenery of the house I was looking at. It was not the view of a real boulder either. It was rather as if the noise was creating the image of a boulder rolling on its monumental sides. I was actually seeing the noise. The inexplicable character of my perception threw me into the depths of despair and confusion. Never in my life would I have conceived that my senses were capable of perceiving in such a manner. I had an attack of rational fright and decided to flee for my life. Don Juan held me by the arm and ordered me imperatively not to run away and not to turn around either, but face the direction in which Don Gennaro had gone. I heard next a series of booming noises, which resembled the sound of rocks falling and piling on top of each other, and then everything was quiet again. A few minutes later Don Gennaro came back and sat down. He asked me if I had seen. I did not know what to say. I turned to Don Juan for a cue. He was staring at me. I think he did, he said and chuckled. I wanted to say that I did not know what they were talking about. I felt terribly frustrated. I had a physical sensation of wrath, of utter discomfort. I think we should leave him here to sit alone, Don Juan said. They got up and walked by me. Carlos is indulging in his confusion, Don Juan said very loudly. I stayed alone for hours and had time to write my notes and to ponder on the absurdity of my experience. Upon thinking about it, it became obvious to me that from the very moment I saw Don Gennaro sitting under the ramada, the situation had acquired a farcical mood. The more I deliberated about it, the more convinced I became that Don Juan had relinquished the control over to Don Gennaro, and that thought filled me with apprehension. Don Juan and Don Gennaro returned at dusk. They sat down next to me, flanking me. Don Gennaro drew closer and almost leaned on me. His thin and frail shoulder touched me lightly, and I experienced the same feeling I had had when he tapped me. A crushing weight toppled me over, and I tumbled onto Don Juan's lap. He helped me to sit up straight and asked in a joking tone if I was trying to sleep on his lap. Don Gennaro seemed to be delighted, his eyes shone. I wanted to weep. I had the feeling I was like an animal that had been corralled. Am I frightening you, little Carlos? Don Gennaro asked and seemed really concerned. You look like a wild horse. Tell him a story, Don Juan said. That's the only thing that calms him. They moved away and sat in front of me. Both of them examined me with curiosity. In the semi-darkness their eyes seemed glassy, like enormous dark pools of water. Their eyes were awesome. They were not the eyes of men. We stared at each other for a moment, and then I moved my eyes away. I noticed that I was not afraid of them, and yet their eyes had frightened me to the point that I was shivering. I felt a most uncomfortable confusion. After a moment of silence, Don Juan urged Don Gennaro to tell me what had happened to him at the time he had tried to outstare his ally. Don Gennaro was sitting a few feet away, facing me. He did not say anything. I looked at him. His eyes seemed to be 4 or 5 tunes the size of ordinary human eyes. They were shining and had a compelling attraction. What seemed to be the light of his eyes dominated everything around them. Don Gennaro's body seemed to have shriveled and looked more like the body of a feline. I noticed a movement of his cat-like body and became frightened. In a completely automatic way, as if I had been doing it all my life, I adopted a fighting form and began beating rhythmically on my calf. When I became aware of my acts, I got embarrassed and looked at Don Juan. He was peering at me as he does ordinarily. His eyes were kind and soothing. He laughed loudly. Don Gennaro made a purring sound and stood up and went inside the house. Don Juan explained to me that Don Gennaro was very forceful and did not like to piddle around, and that he had been just teasing me with his eyes. He said that, as usual, I knew more than I myself expected. He made a comment that everyone who was involved with sorcery was terribly dangerous during the hours of twilight, and that sorcerers like Don Gennaro could perform marvels at that time. We were quiet for a few minutes. I felt better. Talking to Don Juan relaxed me and restored my confidence. Then he said that he was going to eat something, and that we were going for a walk, so that Don Gennaro could show me a technique for hiding. I asked him to explain what he meant by a technique for hiding. He said he was through with explaining things to me because explaining only forced me to indulge. We went inside the house. Don Gennaro had lit the kerosene lantern and was chewing a mouthful of food. After eating, the three of us walked into the thick desert chaparral. Don Juan walked almost next to me. Don Gennaro was in front, a few yards ahead of us. It was a clear night. There were heavy clouds, but enough moonlight to render the surroundings quite visible. At one moment Don Juan stopped and told me to go ahead and follow Don Gennaro. I vacillated. He pushed me gently and assured me it was all right. He said I should always be ready and should always trust my own strength. I followed Don Gennaro, and for the next 2 hours I tried to catch up with him. But no matter how hard I struggled, I could not overtake him. Don Gennaro's silhouette was always ahead of me. Sometimes he disappeared as if he had jumped to the side of the trail, only to appear again ahead of me. As far as I was concerned, this seemed to be a strange and meaningless walk in the dark. I followed because I did not know how to return to the house. I could not understand what Don Gennaro was doing. I thought he was leading me to some recondite place in the chaparral to show me the technique Don Juan had talked about at a certain point. However, I had the peculiar sensation that Don Gennaro was behind me. I turned around and caught a glimpse of a person some distance behind me. The effect was startling. I strained to see in the darkness, and I believed I could make out the silhouette of a man standing perhaps 15 yards away. The figure was almost merged with the bushes. It was as if he wanted to conceal himself. I stared fixedly for a moment, and I could actually keep the silhouette of the man within my field of perception, even though he was trying to hide behind the dark shapes of the bushes. Then a logical thought came to my mind. It occurred to me that the man had to be Don Juan, who must have been following us all the time. The instant I became convinced that that was so, I also realized I could no longer isolate his silhouette. All I had in front of me was the undifferentiated dark mass of the desert chaparral. I walked toward the place I had seen the man, but I could not find anybody. Don Gennaro was nowhere in sight either, and since I did not know my way I sat down to wait. A half hour later, Don Juan and Don Gennaro came by. They called my name out loud. I stood up and joined them. We walked to the house in complete silence. I welcomed that quiet interlude, for I felt completely disoriented. In fact, I felt unknown to myself. Don Gennaro was doing something to me, something which kept me from formulating my thoughts the way I am accustomed to doing. This became evident to me when I sat down on the trail. I had automatically checked the time when I sat down, and then I had remained quiet as if my mind had been turned off. Yet I sat in a state of alertness I have never experienced before. It was a state of thoughtlessness, perhaps comparable to not caring about anything. The world seemed to be, during that time, in a strange balance. There was nothing I could add to it, and nothing I could subtract from it. When we arrived at the house, Don Gennaro rolled out a straw mat and went to sleep. I felt compelled to render my experiences of the day to Don Juan. He did not let me talk. October 18, 1970. I think I understand what Don Gennaro was trying to do the other night, I said to Don Juan. I said that in order to draw him out. His continual refusal to talk was unnerving me. Don Juan smiled and shook his head slowly, as if agreeing with what I had said. I would have taken his gesture as an affirmation except for the strange glint in his eyes. It was as if his eyes were laughing at me. "You don't think I understand, do you?" I asked compulsively. "I suppose you do, in fact. You do understand that Gennaro was behind you all the time. However, understanding is not the real point." His statement that Don Gennaro had been behind me all the time was shocking to me. I begged him to explain it. "Your mind is set to seek only one side of this," he said. He took a dry twig and moved it in the air. He was not drawing in the air or making a figure. What he did resembled the movements he makes with his fingers when he cleans the debris from a pile of seeds. His movements were like a soft prodding or scratching the air with the twig. He turned and looked at me, and I shrugged my shoulders automatically in a gesture of bafflement. He drew closer and repeated his movements, making 8 points on the ground. He circled the first point. "You are here," he said. "We are all here, this is feeling, and we move from here to here." He circled the second, which he had drawn right above number 1. He then moved his twig back and forth between the 2 points to portray a heavy traffic. "There are, however, 6 more points a man is capable of handling," he said. "Most men know nothing about them." He placed his twig between points 1 and 2 and pecked on the ground with it. "To move between these 2 points you call understanding. You've been doing that all your life. If you say you understand my knowledge, you have done nothing new." He then joined some of the 8 points to the others with lines. The result was a long trapezoid figure that had 8 centers of uneven radiation. Each of these 6 remaining points is a world, just like feeling and understanding are 2 worlds for you, he said. "Why 8 points? Why not an infinite number, as in a circle?" I asked. "I drew a circle on the ground." Don Juan smiled. "As far as I know, there are only 8 points a man is capable of handling. Perhaps men cannot go beyond that." And I said handling, not understanding. Did you get that? His tone was so funny I laughed. He was imitating, or rather mocking, my insistence on the exact usage of words. "Your problem is that you want to understand everything, and that is not possible. If you insist on understanding, you're not considering your entire lot as a human being. Your stumbling block is intact, therefore, you have done almost nothing in all these years. You have been shaken out of your total slumber, true, but that could have been accomplished anyway by other circumstances." After a pause, Don Juan told me to get up because we were going to the water canyon. As we were getting into my car, Don Gennaro came out from behind the house and joined us. I drove part of the way and then we walked into a deep ravine. Don Juan picked a place to rest in the shade of a large tree. "You mentioned once," Don Juan began, "that a friend of yours had said, when the 2 of you saw a leaf falling from the very top of a sycamore, that same leaf will not fall again from that same sycamore ever in a whole eternity, remember?" I remembered having told him about that incident. "We are at the foot of a large tree," he continued, "and now if we look at that other tree in front of us, we may see a leaf falling from the very top." He signaled me to look. There was a large tree on the other side of the gully. Its leaves were yellowish and dry. He urged me with a movement of his head to keep on looking at the tree. After a few minutes' wait, a leaf cracked loose from the top and began falling to the ground. It hit other leaves and branches 3 times before it landed in the tall underbrush. "Did you see it?" "Yes." "You would say that the same leaf will never again fall from that same tree, true?" "True. To the best of your understanding, that is true. But that is only to the best of your understanding. Look again." I automatically looked and saw a leaf falling. It actually hit the same leaves and branches as the previous one. It was as if I were looking at an instant television replay. I followed the wavy falling of the leaf until it landed on the ground. I stood up to find out if there were 2 leaves, but the tall underbrush around the tree prevented me from seeing where the leaf had actually landed. Don Juan laughed and told me to sit down. "Look," he said, pointing with his head to the top of the tree. "There goes the same leaf again." I once more saw a leaf falling in exactly the same pattern as the previous two. When it had landed, I knew Don Juan was about to signal me again to look at the top of the tree, but before he did I looked up. The leaf was again falling. I realized then that I had only seen the first leaf cracking loose, or, rather, the first time the leaf fell I saw it from the instant it became detached from the branch. The other 3 times the leaf was already falling when I lifted my head to look. I told that to Don Juan, and I urged him to explain what he was doing. "I don't understand how you're making me see a repetition of what I had seen before." "What did you do to me, Don Juan?" He laughed but did not answer, and I insisted that he should tell me how I could see that leaf falling over and over. I said that according to my reason that was impossible. Don Juan said that his reason told him the same, yet I had witnessed the leaf falling over and over. He then turned to Don Gennaro. "Isn't that so?" he asked. Don Gennaro did not answer. His eyes were fixed on me. "It is impossible," I said. "You're chained," Don Juan exclaimed. "You're chained to your reason." He explained that the leaf had fallen over and over from that same tree, so I would stop trying to understand. In a confidential tone he told me that I had the whole thing pat, and yet my mania always blinded me at the end. "There's nothing to understand. Understanding is only a very small affair, so very small," he said. At that point Don Gennaro stood up. He gave a quick glance to Don Juan. Their eyes met and Don Juan looked at the ground in front of him. Don Gennaro stood in front of me and began swinging his arms at his sides, back and forth in unison. "Look, little Carlos," he said. "Look. Look." He made an extraordinarily sharp swishing sound. It was the sound of something ripping. At the precise instant the sound happened, I felt a sensation of vacuity in my lower abdomen. It was the terribly anguishing sensation of falling, not painful, but rather unpleasant and consuming. It lasted a few seconds and then it subsided, leaving a strange itch in my knees. But while the sensation had lasted, I experienced another unbelievable phenomenon. I saw Don Gennaro on top of some mountains that were perhaps 10 miles away. The perception lasted only a few seconds, and it happened so unexpectedly that I did not have time really to examine it. I cannot recall whether I saw a man-sized figure standing on top of the mountains or a reduced image of Don Gennaro. I cannot even recall whether or not it was Don Gennaro. Yet at that moment I was certain beyond any doubt that I was seeing him standing on top of the mountains. However, the moment I thought that I could not possibly see a man 10 miles away, the perception vanished. I turned around to look for Don Gennaro, but he was not there. The bafflement I experienced was as unique as everything else that was happening to me. My mind buckled under the strain. I felt utterly disoriented. Don Juan stood up and made me cover the lower part of my abdomen with my hands and press my legs tightly against my body in a squat position. We sat in silence for a while, and then he said that he was truly going to refrain from explaining anything to me, because only by acting can one become a sorcerer. He recommended that I leave immediately, otherwise Don Gennaro would probably kill me in his effort to help me. "You are going to change directions," he said, "and you'll break your chains." He said that there was nothing to understand about his or about Don Gennaro's actions, and that sorcerers were quite capable of performing extraordinary feats. Gennaro and I are acting from here, he said, and pointed to one of the centers of radiation in his diagram. And it is not the center of understanding, yet you know what it is. I wanted to say that I did not really know what he was talking about, but he did not give me time and stood up and signaled me to follow him. He began to walk fast, and in no time at all I was puffing and sweating, trying to keep up with him. When we were getting inside the car, I looked around for Don Gennaro. "Where is he?" I asked. "You know where he is," Don Juan snapped at me. Before I left, I sat down with him, as I always do. I had an overwhelming urge to ask for explanations. As Don Juan says, explanations are truly my indulgence. "Where's Don Gennaro?" I asked cautiously. "You know where," he said. "Yet you fail every time because of your insistence on understanding. For example, you knew the other night that Gennaro was behind you all the time. You even turned around and saw him." "No," I protested. "No, I didn't know that." I was truthful at that. My mind refused to intake that sort of stimuli as being real, and yet, after 10 years of apprenticeship with Don Juan, my mind could no longer uphold my old ordinary criteria of what is real. However, all the speculations I had thus far engendered about the nature of reality had been mere intellectual manipulations. The proof was that under the pressure of Don Juan and Don Gennaro's acts, my mind had entered into an impasse. Don Juan looked at me, and there was such sadness in his eyes that I began to weep. Tears fell freely. For the first time in my life, I felt the encumbering weight of my reason. An indescribable anguish overtook me. I wailed involuntarily and embraced him. He gave me a quick blow with his knuckles on the top of my head. I felt it like a ripple down my spine. It had a sobering effect. "You indulge too much," he said softly. Epilogue 8:3. Don Juan slowly walked around me. He seemed to be deliberating whether or not to say something to me. Twice he stopped and seemed to change his mind. "Whether or not you return is thoroughly unimportant," he finally said. "However, you now have the need to live like a warrior. You have always known that, now you're simply in the position of having to make use of something you disregarded before. But you had to struggle for this knowledge. It wasn't just given to you. It wasn't just handed down to you. You had to beat it out of yourself. Yet you're still a luminous being. You're still going to die like everyone else. I once told you that there's nothing to change in a luminous egg." He was quiet for a moment. I knew he was looking at me, but I avoided his eyes. "Nothing has really changed in you," he said. And that's not all. Our experts and regular viewers respond to all comments. Also check if you forgot to subscribe and set your bell to receive notifications about new audiobooks and other useful self-development materials that we release regularly. Join in the discussions, don't forget to give likes and, if possible and inspired, support the development of the channel financially. All useful links will be in the description and the first attached comment. Goodness, love and wisdom to all. And now move on to watch the next part of the video at the links below, or choose something from the playlists of the channel and those you see on the screen.